Hello, we're rolling into another episode of the DRH show. As usual, in each episode, I'll be talking to interesting people within psychology, mental health, and well-being. Today, I'm joined by an expert in organizational behavior. In particular, his works are within leadership, proactive behavior, and motivation. Professor Thomas Bateman, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Dennis. Thank you. Looking forward to talking.
It's great to have you here, Professor Bateman. Let's start off with you telling us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
I've been a lifelong professor. Went to business school, got the doctorate in organizational behavior, and I've been a professor ever since in several universities. But for the last 20 years, at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and have taught around the world, and am now semi-retired, although still affiliated with the university. But organizational behavior as a field, it's psychology and social psychology in the context of the workplace. What goes on when people are working together. So leadership and teamwork and motivation and job stress and job satisfaction and well-being is of recent interest as a what's the word? Not ancestor, but descendant of job satisfaction in the workplace. Well-being, of course, much broader and more dynamic, and a definite interest in our field of organizational behavior. And it's the topic is resided in management departments in business schools.
And of course, now you've been writing blog articles for, of course, Psychology Today, and of course, it's not also a secret that you're also writing articles for Psychreg. And I'm just wondering how you came about starting writing blog articles. Was this something that you started when you became semi-retired, or has this always been, one of your endeavors?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. It's fairly recent. I've always, as a professor, I've always been writing. Academic articles, plus a textbook. I write a college textbook, a management textbook. So writing's been a constant thing over the decades. But then in recent years, maybe a decade ago, I became especially interested in writing for broader audiences. Partly that's been driven by, I'll back up one step and say that I've studied academically, empirically, and theoretically, I've studied a number of different topics over the decades in organizational behavior, but eventually things came to coalesce, and I came to understand that proactivity was an underlying theme, and I focused more on that explicitly, became more concentrated in my writing efforts, and as fellow researchers in my field started studying proactivity, it is now a booming arena for at least our behavior research. And I've come to realize how very important it is, how very practical it is, how very applicable it is, how helpful it is in so many ways. Although it's risky also, and we'll probably touch on that. I went a long time before I became so energized about the applicability of my work that when proactivity finally dawned on me explicitly, and that's when I started wanting to reach out to broader audiences, and I've been doing it ever since. It's been very fun. It's a different kind of writing, and I still think I'm not as I don't know. I'm still a little bit of a stodgy academic, even when writing blogs, but I'm loosening up some, and it's been enjoyable, and I'm really glad to be reaching wider audiences. And I appreciate your interest. You've been a very, very good supporter of my blogs. And I'll add one more step to that. I've become even more excited when I came to realize, this is now about a decade ago, that the broad class of behaviors that we call proactivity, which is a very unusual type of behavior, which I'll elaborate on, but it struck me, a subsequent realization was that there is no more important domain that requires more proaction than sustainability and climate action. We need to be more proactive in those domains. and that doubled my energy for reaching out to wider audiences. And it's been kind of an inspiring late career, rejuvenation because the context and the impact of proaction is so important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So those are the things you're right. Now, I want to step a bit back. Of course, as part of your academic career, you've been director of a pan-university leadership minor for undergraduates at the University of Virginia. So now let's talk broadly about leadership. What have you written about this topic in addition to President Trump?
Okay, I have written a little bit about President Trump, and thanks for mentioning that. Leadership is a topic that also really offers a context where proaction is a vital thing. And again, I think not enough leaders are proactive enough. For leadership means creating change, as opposed to maintaining routines. And proaction at its heart is creating new ways of doing things and ways to improve, finding opportunities to pursue, finding problems to solve. And proaction is what underlies all those action-oriented accomplishments. And by the way, back in the day when I was a doctoral student and early career professor, leadership was a topic that my field did research in it, but it was a small subset of organizational behavior. And at the time, it was not a very interesting one. And I think that same statement applies to social psychology. There were some social psychologists writing about leadership, but not very many. And the more exciting work was done in maybe in public administration and certainly in political science broadly was a more exciting arena for leadership research. But suddenly, leadership as a topic became energized in my field of work, behavior. It became much more expansive, much more dynamic. The theories of charisma and transformational leadership became much more interesting and compelling, and more people started working in the area. And it is now exploded, including in education, from higher education, where leadership is a thing every student seems to want to talk about and every university seems to want to brag about as a thing they try to inspire and cultivate in their students. And I think in what we call middle schools and high schools in the US, leadership is a key word also, where students want to add the word to their applications in any way they can. It's now a booming and very broad topic. Anyway, at University of Virginia, we decided to initiate, this is in the mid-2000s, I think, yeah, roughly. We decided to create a leadership minor, a pan-university minor, which is to say students in any major, undergrads in any major, could apply to enter the minor. And it was a small program. It was competitive to get in, but it was a big point about it was multidisciplinary. So students of all majors were very welcome. And it was a very fun thing to teach. I saw a lot of, eye-opening moments in the way I talked about it for the students in ways that was really re-energizing for me. Anyway, the minor still continues at UVA, and although I'm now living in Chicago and semi-retired, like I said, so I'm not directing it, but it's been going for like 15 years now. Great fun. It's given me some identity because org behavior is kind of a vague field with a vague definition. A lot of people haven't heard of it. Leadership, the subdomain of leadership is recognized. The word is recognizable to everybody, and it's given me a focus. And especially when I see proactivity as central to great leadership, it's been a good way to focus for me, and like I say, really rejuvenating. And you mentioned President Trump. Yes, I've written about President Trump, and I started doing that partly because it was so challenging and intriguing and a little bit scary to try to talk about leadership and use the United States president without being overly political without letting my political bias, trying not to let my political bias go through. And that was a big challenge. And I was proud of the fact that the students and I together, we were able to talk about strengths and weaknesses, mistakes and successes, et cetera, of not only President Trump, but several previous presidents, to be able to talk about it without political bias, but with thoughtful discussion about what works and what doesn't work. And so I wrote a couple of things about what we can learn about leadership from Donald J. Trump, knowing that a lot of people, I should say, quickly say, I know overseas, and certainly within the U.S., a lot of people quickly say, sure, cynically, caustically, sure, we can learn what not to do. But at the same time, there are plenty of people that are offended by a comment like that. Either way, I find it challenging and worth working on the fact that people love him or hate him, speaking of Trump. Either way, they're not going to learn much about leadership from President Trump. If people automatically think everything he does is wrong, or automatically think everything he does is right and great, neither party will learn much. So I try to write and sometimes give talks about how to think thoughtfully rather based on emotional reaction to this leader.
Okay. Now, while Trump is a fascinating topic, I want to touch further on proactivity, because this is also something that you write a lot about. And at one point you said that proactivity is the superpower that you can and should develop. Can you just explain why that is?
Sure. Just a little context to repeat what I said earlier. Proactivity is a rare thing. And more often than not, a difficult thing. And I think it is core to many potential positive impacts, many potential positive outcomes. We've studied it primarily in the workplace, and it's got many benefits, although also risks. It is core to climate action, core to sustainability, core to leadership that makes a real difference, as opposed to being in a leadership role and just keeping heads above water, business as usual. And by the way, no, that's not meant as a negative statement. There's a vital role for keeping heads above water and keeping things rolling adequately, especially in times of crisis, of course. But proactive leadership sees problems and tackles them, sees opportunities and pursues them, creates positive change for the better. So it's such an important category of behavior. Now, I guess I'll say what it is conceptually, and then elaborate with some practicalities, or more specific practicalities. It is unusual because most of what we do, most of what human behavior is fairly habitual and fairly routine. So much of what we do is driven by what we did yesterday. So much of what we do today will be more or less repeated tomorrow. So much of what we do is pretty unthinking. So a lot of your viewers know of thinking fast and slow, or what Kahneman and Tversky called System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 thinking being automatic, rather unthinking information processing. So we prey to cognitive heuristics and cognitive errors because we don't fully think things through. Automatic processing. System 2 thinking is more deliberative, more actively and effortfully thoughtful, which provides opportunity to think things through more carefully before deciding, to plan more thoroughly before acting, etc. So System 1 thinking is not, it does not create proaction. System 2, more thoughtfulness, thinking through, identifying multiple options, trying to avoid biases that will take people down the wrong path. Deliberative thought processes are the beginning of proaction. Proaction is intentional. And then more specifically, it means thinking further down the road into the future than we usually do, or than most people do. Most people, we not only are driven by past habits, but also by circumstances in the here and now. And we also tend to do what current circumstances are telling us to do or asking to do. Proaction means departing from current pressures and departing from past habits. It means thinking strategically about what trajectory I'm on right now, or my team is on right now, or my company is on right now. What trajectory are we on now? And thinking down the road, where are we going to be next week or next quarter or next year if we stay on this trajectory? Proactive means thinking, again, strategically through the consequences of staying on this path versus the maybe more visionary possibilities of changing course, departing from current trajectories, creating a new trajectory. So proaction is not only thoughtful and strategic, it's more future focused. It creates change. It creates better futures than whatever trajectories we currently are on. And all that is less common than the more routine, not very forward-thinking, let's do what we've been doing, business as usual kind of behaviors. So it's fairly rare.
Now, sorry.
That's okay. Elaborating a little bit on the practicalities of it, that was all pretty conceptual. And might I add that was all very different from what most people think when they use the word proactive. We should have been more proactive. Should have been more proactive. She or he could have been more proactive, and they wouldn't find themselves in this current predicament had they been more proactive. Mostly what that means is, in kind of the lay usage of the word, mostly that means I should have started studying a week ago instead of started studying at midnight, the morning of the test. Or this employee, this manager should have started working on the presentation a week ago instead of waiting till yesterday. Starting earlier, sooner rather than later is the usual definition. The opposite of procrastination is the usual definition of proaction. What I've been studying in others is much deeper, more profoundly important. So what I went through was pretty conceptual. On the practical front, it does mean taking action when others are not. It does mean, as I said earlier, spotting problems and not just ignoring them, but speaking up about them, and better yet, doing something about them, tackling. So if you tackle a problem, or if you spot an opportunity and go after it, when other, say, your employee colleagues or your professorial colleagues are not, here's our dog Angus. Angus says hello. He's making sure I don't offer any mistaken definitions of terms. He monitors me to make sure I sound academic. If there's a problem in your workplace or an opportunity in your workplace, and others aren't noticing it or are noticing it and not paying attention to it, they are not being proactive. They're being aware, but they're not being proactive. If you are the one who decides to tackle something important, you are being proactive. And by the way, it can range from little things like speaking up in a meeting. Think of how often people sit in meetings and don't speak up. But you'll know it as employee voice speaking up. So often people are silent. To speak up when others are not speaking up is the beginning of proaction. It is a small, quick example of proaction while others are being silent. And then are also huge examples of proaction. Starting a new company, creating something that didn't exist before is proactive. To be a champion of a cause within your organization is proaction. It's a form of leadership that others weren't exhibiting because if it wasn't being tackled before, et cetera. Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, I was just about to say that, of course, this psychological notion of proactivity is tied into another thing that you often write about, climate change. So I was just going to say, I think that you mentioned that proactivity is the opposite of procrastination. So would you mind like talking about proactivity and procrastination in light of climate change? And basically what I'm asking is that, you know, so some people are not proactive and we are more prone to procrastinate. So based from your experience, do you have any ideas how we can actually motivate people towards sustainability, taking action to address climate change?
There's so much to talk about, and there are people, and I've learned a lot. Some about it. I also write, by the way, for a professional magazine called Green Biz. I've written maybe half a dozen columns, mostly with one or another form of proactive theme to it. But I want to quickly add a statement. I wouldn't say that proactivity is the opposite of procrastination. I would say that not procrastinating is the bare minimum of proaction. It is taking an initial action, and that's opposite of inaction, of procrastination. But proaction has all those other vitally important components to it, of forward thinking and strategic thinking, and not just the first step, but continued persistence and learning along the way and rethinking and continuing to the point of making a difference. And all that pertains to climate action, the domain of climate change. So your question is profoundly important. There are people who've been studying that for decades, the people who have lifelong deep expertise in the psychology of climate action. Unfortunately, there's not nearly enough people studying that. And there's not nearly enough people paying attention to those who write about it. But a few opening comments in no particular order. I don't know how to think of what is the most important thing, but here's a few things that come to my mind. I'll say one thing to you. On the point of continuing through time, that's definitely really important to climate action. How many of us do something environmentally friendly or something that the climate will benefit from in a minor way, and then relax because we've done something on behalf of sustainability? You know it, your listeners might know it as a psychological license or moral license. I've done something that makes me feel good about myself. I've done something that makes a positive contribution. I've convinced myself I care about the climate or sustainability, and maybe I've demonstrated to others that I care. And now on to the next thing, which might be anything, which could be anything. So I dropped the ball on my climate action. So genuine, impactful proaction requires persistence over time. I will say that many deep experts on climate change, which is to say the psychology of climate change, have told me that it has been a liability psychologically to the broad public to link it so strongly to, this will sound cynical, but to polar bears, to more broadly to nature. That appeals greatly to those of us who care about those things. And that's a big enough group that it's been very positively impactful to link it to nature and iconic species. Unfortunately, though, it has a limited appeal when it comes to every group and population around the globe. For many people, the natural impacts are irrelevant. And to mention a polar bear or to mention, the pejorative tree huggers is to turn audiences immediately. And a huge, better point about climate change is that it affects everybody and everything. And we seem to be reaching a turning point where more people are starting to realize that. It is about nature, sure, but it is now more visible. There are fewer deniers than there used to be. More people more inclined to find ways to take action if they can. And the reasons for actions range from the impact on our food supplies, our water supplies, public health, migration and immigration, farming, conflict, war, et cetera, et cetera. In the US, which of course is not the most progressive country when it comes to caring about climate change and sustainability, and it fluctuates from one administration to another. But in the US, the military, the Pentagon, is deeply concerned about climate change and has been for decades. And I don't understand why that is not better publicized. Because, well, when our military cares, you would think more of our population would care. Anyway, the bottom line point is when it comes to communicating effectively with an audience, don't make it so much about what the climate activist cares about. Make it about whatever common ground can be found that the audience can care about. One of the great climate communicators is Katharine Hayhoe of Texas Tech University. She is a climate scientist, a hard sciences, as they say, but she's also a phenomenal communicator. And she is very interested in farming, for instance, and she always wants to find people who are especially good at talking to the farming community about climate change and climate action. She is also an evangelical Christian, has been all her life, and she communicates to that audience, some of whom embrace climate action and some of whom do not. However, she speaks to them on the grounds that they care about and is immensely effective. So that's just a huge point. It impacts everything, and the world doesn't necessarily know that.
And I just want to touch upon what you raised earlier. You mentioned about climate change denial. And of course, there are people who don't really subscribe to the idea of, climate change. So you briefly explain on this that it could be something to do with the politics, or is it more about personality trait, or is it because they just simply lack proactivity? How would you explain that?
Really good question. I've really felt for years that, although I'm starting to change my mind a little bit, but I've really felt for years that it's almost not worth the effort to try to convince a hardcore denier. And by the way, it is very much politics. And it's not so much political, it's partly political party apparently, but more broadly it's ideology broadly, and largely about freedom and independence, as opposed to don't tell me what to do, and maybe I don't trust the government or I don't trust experts who study these things. I'll make my own decisions. So I think ideology is the biggest thing. And then once you identify the certain groups, you continue to maintain, and you fall prey to confirmation bias, as you know about. Even incoming information gets rejected because your mind is made up, and you've also thought through the arguments on your own side, opposed to thinking through the arguments on both sides. So I wouldn't call it personality in terms of like the big five, the psychologists think about personality. I would say, though, speaking of psychological terms, Bandura's self-efficacy term is a huge driver here, I do believe. People's belief in their ability to perform a task or accomplish a goal. People who care about climate change don't take much action because they think their actions can't make much difference. I'm just one person, what can I do? My self-efficacy to actually make a difference on climate change is very, very low. I think that's the really important psychological driver here. And climate educators should talk more about not just the scientific facts of climate change, but should talk about the psychology of climate action, including self-efficacy. And there are ways that individuals can make a difference. For adults in democracies, without doubt, the voting booth is where all the difference in the world can be made. But not everybody embraces that point or really thinks about that point. If you can't make much difference by yourself, you can become a climate champion, which is to say a leader or a proponent of some particular group action or collective action at your company or at your university or in your community. And one individual taking on the role of a climate leader starts to enlist the collaboration of other people. Now it's not just me alone, it's a more collective effort. And without doubt, we're going to need more grassroots leadership from the ground up, bottom up leadership, especially under political circumstances where the top down leadership isn't delivering on climate change. And thankfully, there's been a lot of ground up leadership at the community and school and company level. But that's not top down as necessarily as much as it is bottom up. So engagement that way. One of our articles, I did write an article with Mike Mann, the great climate scientist who published a famous iconic hockey stick showing temperatures rising in recent years along with CO2 emissions rising. And Michael Mann, M-A-N-N, is a great climate scientist. But he and I co-authored a piece in Nature, Climate Change. And one of the points we make, including the title actually refers to this, there's a big supply-demand imbalance of climate leaders. The supply and demand of climate leaders is way out of whack. We need more climate leaders, which is to say the demand is high. The supply of climate leaders is far too low, and we need more to step up and take the role upon themselves and enlist the help of others. And that, by the way, includes not just mayors and CEOs and teachers and things, but and not just bottom up as well as top down, but also horizontal leadership, where people step out of their silos and reach out to somebody in a different silo, be it a different research field or a different geographical bound area or country, or different sector, public-private sector partnerships, et cetera, reach across boundaries and collaborate across boundaries and find ways to leverage, the multidisciplinarity and the multiple knowledge bases that can be brought together in higher leverage. But I think a great point of supply-demand imbalance. We need more climate leaders.
You've been talking a great deal about behavior change. I suppose what we can actually benefit from behavior change is through organizations at work. So how do you think we can drive behavior change at work through communications?
Well, I paused for a minute there because behavior change, of course, as you know, is infinitely complex and involved. And then it got more. Your question got more specific when you mentioned communication. I'll say first off, I have not studied. I've not published an article on managerial communication. generally speaking. But I'll tell you some of the points I've made in some of the broad points I've made in writing about management.
Mm-hmm.
One is that most people under-communicate. And that certainly includes managers from top higher levels to lower levels. But it also almost certainly and universally includes lower level people communicated in the upward direction, talking honestly to their bosses is far too rare. And of course, and by the way, to initiate a good, important conversation is an act of proaction. It is proactive. It is jump-starting a conversation that wouldn't exist if you hadn't taken this unusual action. That is proaction. And like I touched upon at the beginning, there are risks to proaction. Some bosses don't want to hear your ideas. But I've certainly done plenty of things where the lowest level employees have great ideas, but they're either not interested in talking to their bosses about it, not interested in pursuing the idea themselves. Maybe the bosses create a culture of, of quashing upward communication. And by the way, something else broad point about communication is so many bosses send mixed signals. Yes, come talk to me anytime you've got a problem you want to share. I'm all ears. But in fact, they're not. In fact, they don't want to have such conversations, so they send mixed signals. Clarity of communication is a big, broad point, and minimizing mixed signals so there's not much confusion is a big, broad point. And by the way, these points pertain to the current, coronavirus. Mm-hmm. Pandemic. Mixed signals causes chaos, and in turn causes bad results. Mm-hmm. Signals from leaders,
or signals from experts, even.
And yes.
I just want to contextualize my comment. I said signals from experts because it's a fact that Sweden did not impose a lockdown compared to other countries, and that's what I mean by difference of signals from experts.
Okay, and you've also made a point about that's relevant to communications. Mm-hmm. Shutting off communications with experts versus opening avenues for communications with people who know more than the decision maker knows. Mm-hmm. What leader in this complicated world, what leader knows all there is to know about the biggest challenges we face? Mm-hmm. To open up communication avenues to the people who know the most. And what leaders, and so many leaders don't do that. So if I may, you asked at the beginning about President Trump. My most recent one is an article about, with a leadership lesson involving him, is in, it's in Medium and in Psychology Today. And it's titled something like Learning About Leadership, or maybe Learning About Crisis Leadership from Donald Trump. Don't fall prey to the not invented here syndrome. Mm-hmm. NIH, the not invented here syndrome. It is a cognitive bias that most of us fall prey to. By the way, it is not in many, if any, classic lists of cognitive biases, but it is a big one. I so much favor my own ideas, I'm not interested in other people's ideas. Mm-hmm. And it's human to sort of have that idea. Sometimes it is poor leadership to make that a trademark of your decision-making style, that I know best and others do not. Or I and my in-group, mm-hmm. that small handful of us always know best. Mm-hmm. That is shutting down communication from sources who can help make good decisions.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose that's also a bit of a personality trait. Is that right? That not invented here syndrome, is that, would you classify that as a personality trait?
Do you know, that's a very good question, and it probably is. I mean, I wouldn't call that a trait, that's syndrome, but also, as far as I know, it has never been studied by personality psychologists or by anybody using measures of traits like the Big Five or the Hexaco measures. I don't think it's been studied that way, but for instance, one could well imagine that the Big Five variable of openness to experience might be related to openness to hearing ideas outside my own, or dogmatism on other personality scales, etc. So it hasn't been studied, but no doubt there are some traits that might be related. May I use that point, the point you're asking about, to make what I think is an important point about proactivity? It has largely been studied in my field of organizational behavior, largely studied as a trait. And to look up keywords, for research, you're looking up keywords, proactive personality sometimes works as a key, well, would work as a keyword. But I try hard to convey that I think is a limiting perspective. I think the word personality is overused. And this is not a slam on personality research, and I do some also. I think lay people overuse the word personality. And that pertains to proactivity, which maybe apparently there is a somewhat stable tendency where people are disposed to be highly proactive individuals, and other people might be disposed to be not very proactive individuals. However, I always want to convey as strongly as possible, it's also learnable. Proaction is learnable. When you start to think and start to learn what it's all about, you can start asking yourself, what would I do here if I wanted to be more proactive? You can learn, you can acquire more of the tendency to be proactive, or in a single specific circumstance, you can make a conscious decision. I might not be a very proactive person generally, but in this case, I'm going to be. Now, how should I think this through? What would be the most effective thing to do? Now, if I may, and I taught Myers-Briggs for, a couple of years in a very frequently in a certain 2-year stretch, but also off and on over decades. I've taught Myers-Briggs, and it's always interesting and fun and informative to people. But there's a downside to it. No matter how much an instructor insists that you're not stuck in this box of 4 letters, and insists that you can be, if you're an introvert, you can sometimes behave in an extroverted fashion. No matter how much that point is attempted, people remember their 4 letters. And they constrain themselves by implicitly, if not literally, thinking of themselves as constrained by their 4 letters. So I hope I haven't said anything to offend any Myers-Briggs people. May I add that when I took the Myers-Briggs, when I took the training in one of their official sessions, I was thinking somewhere in England, maybe Oxford, but I'm not sure. One of my favorite things was a metaphor that they offered of telling we, the students in the class, to imagine just a simple drawing of a house, say a basic square house with a roof, an upside down V-shaped roof, patience here, patience, and then lines within the square of 16, there are 16 rooms in the house, representing the 16 4-letter Myers-Briggs combinations. There are 16 different cells in that Myers-Briggs grid, right? They told us, and I thought this was right on, and I always said this when I taught that. Don't imagine that your 4-letter room is your favorite room in the house, and when you've been away on a work trip for 2 weeks and you're getting home and you're so glad to be home, it's the room you're gonna go into first, and you're going to crash and you're going to relax and you're going to turn on a movie or a game or music or whatever you do. This is your favorite room in the house because you're the most comfortable there. Mm-hmm. But do you really want to spend your entire life in that room? You should also bring an exploratory mindset.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, good. Break out of that room once in a while. Find things to enjoy in the other rooms. And a great point to make about Myers-Briggs generally, but every other personality trait. If you consider yourself not very proactive, that doesn't mean you should always not be very proactive just because it's comfortable. Mm-hmm. And by the way,
it may sound cliche, but we always hear it from from psychologists and people who are working in behavior science that you can't really contain behavior in a box. So that's why you've got different perspectives in psychology.
And adding to that, I think sometimes people keep themselves in a box unnecessarily, or if it confines them, it definitely confines them. Hey, so may I tell you some of the things we have related our proactive scale to in the workplace? Some of the benefits of proactivity there are now dozens and dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of studies now about proactivity in the workplace. And these are some of the benefits, although, gotta say again, it can be risky. Mm-hmm. Think about it. This is being, for one thing, action-oriented, when maybe your boss prefers a more passive person who keeps his or her thoughts to himself or herself. So think about who you might raise your idea with before raising it. Or think about the timing of when is a good time to raise an idea with your boss. By the way, if you take upon yourself the role of a champion of climate action in your workplace, some people might love you for it and embrace your efforts and say, yeah, I'm with you, I'm behind you. But what if your efforts fail? You've lost maybe some cachet around the workplace if your efforts fail. More deeply, odds are some people will love you for your efforts and others will not like you at all for your efforts if you're trying to change things. People resist change inherently, and proaction is about creating change. So full awareness is important about the risks and the need to think strategically before starting into a big proactive initiative, okay? But on net, over time, to be more proactive compared to less proactive on net and over time, to be more proactive has been empirically related to more job satisfaction, more higher job performance, less job stress, more career advancement, more multiple measures of career success, from subjective career satisfaction to objective promotions and pay raises. It's been related collectively to team performance, to innovation, to employee voice, speaking up, which we talked about earlier, certain kinds of productive leadership styles, to entrepreneurship, starting new companies, et cetera, et cetera. It is just a vast array of positive outcomes for both individuals and teams and organizations. And when we talk about climate change and sustainability, we're talking about society as well, although I'm not much aware of empiricism yet in that arena. Okay. So the last thing I want people to think of is that proaction is a personality trait and I don't have it. Or I am ESTJ at the Myers-Briggs and therefore I'll always be an ESTJ. Oh, Dennis, you actually asked me once before about something I called in a blog on the most the most important personality trait. I titled one thing, the most important personality trait.
And what would that be?
Pardon me?
What would you say the most important personality trait would be?
Thanks for asking. I wasn't going to keep you in the dark, but I will say that I hate titles like that because there's never the most important, except for this one. It's what the psychologist Brian Little of Cambridge calls the free trait. Free traits. And what he means by a free trait is something that's been measured on personality trait measures that indicates that a person is whatever, the Myers-Briggs score, let's say fixed mindset. The free trait is one that can vary. You are free and willing and able to not always show your basic trait. So someone who measures as a fixed mindset in Carol Dweck terms can learn how to be more of a growth mindset individual. A free trait is one that is free to vary. Brian Little's most easily relatable example, I think, is the person who is introverted is not stuck with being introverted all the time. That person can behave in an extroverted fashion, and vice versa. An extrovert should not be extroverted all the time. An extrovert would do well to be aware of when it's better to sit back and let others.
Yeah, I can confirm that you're talking to an introvert, but I think I'm quite good in social occasions.
And that's exactly, and by the way, to be honest, I say the same thing about myself. And I don't know what your students might say, Dennis, but when I tell students I'm an introvert, which I promise is true, they don't believe it because they see me only in front of a classroom is where we kind of behave more extrovertedly because that's the expectations. Most people see only a slice of other people. In our cases, our students see only the front of the room slice. Maybe that's an exaggeration, or I don't, but you know what I'm saying here. A free trait Brian Little talks about, and I recommend his work, Little, Brian, Brian. Free is one that you express across the entire range of possibilities instead of staying stuck at the one end of the range. So I call that the most important trait.
Brilliant. Now, talking about the most important trait, what I want to ask you now, Professor Bateman, is what is the most important thing you want the public to know about your work?
It's a great question. And just a few minutes ago, I said, I don't like the most important kind of a title, but it is a great question in a broad context. And I think the things are, and I can't say one, but they're related, and it'll be short, or as short as you want it to be. But I would say proaction is rare. It's a rare thing. And if you think it through strategically to minimize the risks of it, the net of it over time is positive in so many ways. And I would like word for that to get out farther. It is not it's not really in the lexicon, other than a certain academic research in organizational behavior, and the word proactive is in the lexicon at the level of, I wish I hadn't procrastinated. But it's profoundly deeper than that. And I'll tack on, leadership should be about changing things for the better, and that is proaction. And sustainability and climate action are about not only changing things for the better, but here's something I didn't really highlight about proaction. It is not only more future focused, the farther ahead you can think, and the farther ahead your actions will have an impact, the more proactive you are being. Mm-hmm. So long-term thinking is a part of this equation here that is all too rare.
Mm-hmm. And is there a particular individual who has the greatest influence on your work?
So I'm sorry I'm pausing here, but I kind of, every once in a while you're asking a good question and I think my answer is going to disappoint. Early on, I was inspired by, I'm not going to name names if you don't mind, but I was inspired early on by people who published good articles on a variety of different topics. I admired breadth in scholarship. But that kind of flies in the face of what a lot of people are pressured to do. Most people are pressured to be deep and narrow. Mm-hmm. And that includes not only academia, but most of the real world of work. We admire deep specialization and deep expertise. And breadth isn't necessarily honored the way it was way back in the day. I mean, the days of the Renaissance person. But there's if I may, another metaphor of the T-shaped professional, the capital letter T, as in Tom. Imagine a capital letter, and this concerns how to think about a career of being both broad and deep. Mm-hmm. And I like this model as an inspiration. The vertical line of the capital letter T is your depth, is the domain in which you have deep expertise. And the horizontal of the T represents breadth. The going across domain, right? So I think it's a really useful metaphor for people to think in career-wise and how they tackle their jobs. What do I want the shape of my T to look like? If you want pure depth, you want a strong vertical line. Mm-hmm. If you want pure breadth, you want a strong horizontal line. But you could also think, and this is the way I think, in terms of having both breadth and depth in whatever balance you like. But I do think the toughest problems, what a lot of people call the wicked problems of the world, require multidisciplinary thinking and multidisciplinary research and crossing boundaries and at least being able to work with people in different silos. If not having technical or scientific or functional expertise in those silos, at least having the behavioral willingness and ability to collaborate with people and create a team with a great capital T, broad and breadth and depth. I like that metaphor as an inspiration, okay? And then finally, more specifically, climate change is an ultimate multidisciplinary collaborative effort where we need deep expertise and breadth and collaboration across silos. And that is the ultimate proaction, thinking long-term on behalf of the future. So those are my main things I'd like people to remember.
Okay. Now, for my next question, Professor Bateman, I'll be a less psychological. So what's your distressing outlet? By that, I mean, what's your other interest aside from psychology?
So de-stressing. Back in the day, I would have quickly said sports. And then I hurt my back when I was 38, playing a third basketball game after having not played in a couple of years. So I admonish your viewers to not overdo if you haven't been working out much. And since then, not many sports. So I guess writing is a de-stressor. I write a textbook, and that's a relaxing thing. And we do a travel, including adventure travel. including a lot of outdoor types of travel. Those are de-stressors. And then not to mention family and our dog, Angus, who you met briefly.
Yeah. I'm sure everyone would get to know Angus now. Actually, you're not the first person to be, I wouldn't say interrupted, but the dog came. There was also another guest that I was talking to 2 weeks ago, Chris Nicholson. Some viewers might have seen that. He's got, I think it was a Labradoodle. Professor Bateman, what's in the pipeline, and what's in the pipeline, and where can we learn more about you? Did you say you have an upcoming book?
Oh, thank you. First I'll say in the pipeline, my main writing efforts until yesterday was to finish a new edition of a textbook. I write a college textbook. It's called Management. Yeah, it's for management courses in business schools. I'll tell you the subtitle. I kind of like the subtitle of Management. They're all named Management. Our subtitle is Leading and Collaborating in a Competitive World. Mm-hmm. So I like the focus on leadership and the focus on collaboration, mm-hmm. retaining the realism that it is a competitive world out there. So that's a frequent thing. But my webpage is at my university, the McIntire School of Commerce, University of Virginia is my main webpage. And my other writing is in Psych Today, as you mentioned, Psychology Today, Psychreg, Medium, and that journal for sustainability professionals called Green Biz. Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you for asking that.
Mm-hmm. I'll put all of those on the video description box, so those who are interested, they can head over to this website. Now, this is my final question to you, Professor Bateman, and I always ask my guests about this question. What's one thing about psychology that you think we should talk more about?
Sorry for the pause, but it would be my bias partly leads to the immediate thought that proaction, it is a unique class of behaviors, relatively unstudied. In psychology, it's relatively unstudied. The attention it is getting is inward behavior. Mm-hmm. But I also think, the psychology of climate action, mm-hmm. more scholars, needs more researchers, needs more taught, how to teach climate action in middle schools and high schools and college. Mm-hmm. But beyond those things that I'm so interested in, I think of like Daniel Kahneman, thinking fast and slow. I think the kind of the metacognition is a great domain for understanding and thinking about, learning more about how we think. And then that includes how we make good decisions. And then go to the next step is the link between knowing something and actually taking action on what we know. Mm-hmm. There's management called the knowing-doing gap. We know a heck of a lot, but we don't often enough use our knowledge.
Brilliant. Professor Bateman, it's been an insightful conversation with you, but unfortunately our time is up. I really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise, and I look forward to hearing more about your work.
My pleasure. Good questions, and I thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.